Hello, and welcome to the new episode of the FatFeministWitch podcast. I am your host, Paige, and today I'm going to be talking about an actual modern history of witchcraft. This is a little bit harder to get than you would think, although the information is totally out there. And I find that a lot of times when I get a history lesson about witchcraft, it talks about the 1600s and earlier, and then stops at the 20th century. And I find that troubling for a couple of reasons that I'm going to go over. So before I get started, it is the holiday season, and Yule and the solstice are coming up. So for those pagans who celebrate that, I hope you have a great time. Christmas is still the one that we do here. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Solstice, Happy Yule, Happy all of the other ones that I don't know or can't pronounce. I just hope you guys have a really great holiday season. Happy holidays. So, like I said, today we're talking about a modern history of witchcraft. And this is something that I've wanted to do for a little while because I actually sat in on a class once it was a modern Wicca class. Like, modern Wicca was right in the name of the class. And then this girl started in on a history lesson that began before the 1600s. And the most recent history that I got out of this lesson was about a whole sentence, and it just said, in the 30s, 50s, and 70s, witchcraft became popular again and Wicca started being practiced. And that was about all she said. And I was pretty shocked, especially because this is a Wicca class. Now, I'm gonna use the word Wicca a lot in this episode, and I really don't want to offend any Wiccans. But I find that Wiccans are the worst perpetrators of this fake history lesson, so much so that I've started calling it the Wiccan history lesson. And people just know what I'm talking about. So I really don't mean to offend Wiccans at all. If those are your beliefs, go forth and be Wiccan. Be the best Wiccan you can be. But I want you guys to stop telling this history lesson as if it's facts. And maybe look at it at what it actually is, which is Wiccan mythology. So the mythological part of this history lesson you always get is about the burning times. About how 9 million witches were burned in England, all because they practiced this unifying pre-Christian pagan witchcraft-based faith. And I just got to tell you that none of that is real. None of it's real. None of those are facts. Now, witch hunts, witch trials, these all obviously happened. I talked about Salem in maybe my first or second episode there, and we know those happened. But the rest is kind of bad. So first of all, there weren't 9 million people. It was not the worst Holocaust in history, and when people say that, I personally get super offended. That was not the worst genocide in history. You've got to be shitting me. So that is a fact people need to stop spreading. It's closer to about 40 or 50,000 people. That's still a lot of people, and 40 to 50,000 people really did die. And the official cause of death might even have been that they were killed for being a witch. Some of them were burned, though not in Salem. Everyone in Salem was hanged except for one person. But in Europe, some were burned, some were dragged through the streets, some were hung. It was disgusting and it was horrible. But none of those people that died were actual witches practicing witchcraft as we know it today. That's absolutely not what happened. Most of those people that died were average people who fell victim to mass hysteria. Just like in Salem, they didn't do anything wrong. Other people wanted to get rid of them, and so they made things up. It's also possible that some of them were regular Christians living in a Catholic land, and the Catholics viewed Christianity as heresy, and vice versa. And so many of those people that died were Catholic or Christian, and they were just viewed as heretics. Many of the people who died were just weird. They lived out on the outskirts of town and no one ever talked to them, and they just assumed they were doing something wrong. Many of those people that died probably practiced a folk tradition that included something that we would consider magic now. Tons of people like that died because it was very common. It's very common in all cultures. But there isn't... What this history lesson tries to prove is that there is a link between this very early European witchcraft, quote unquote, and modern witchcraft that we practice now. And there just isn't. There just isn't that link at all. And I need you to realize that there's a blank space. There's a blank space between those two things. They're different. So the Burning Times is not, it's not a real thing. That is not a real witchcraft thing, but it is very good mythology. And it does speak very loudly to the importance of religious tolerance, tolerance for other people in general, not falling to ignorance or mass hysteria, just like the Salem witch trials. But the Burning Times is a very popular Wiccan situation that I just need people to stop perpetrating. Wicca is the most popular version of religious-based witchcraft that is practiced, and I don't just mean, North America, I mean Europe, all over. It has even spread to India and to other parts of Southeast Asia lately in the last few years. So it's really all over the world. And it's also the one that we have some of the best documentation for. So like I said, I'm going to talk about Wicca a lot specifically. Wicca is also kind of a jumping off point for a lot of people who later don't identify as Wiccan, but just as regular pagans or witches or what have you. That was the case for me. I came into Wicca in the golden age of the Wiccan 90s, and I'm going to get into that pretty in depth because I think it was just the best decade for witchcraft ever. But I did as well, and then I found it just wasn't for me later, and that's kind of the case for a lot of people. The Wiccan history lesson tells you that Wicca is this ancient religion. It goes all the way back, but how old is Wicca really? I can say, with a good conscience, as a learned historian, that the furthest back I'd feel comfortable saying it goes is the 1940s. And that's nothing to shake a stick at, that's still a long time. But Wicca was invented in the 1940s. Wicca was invented, it was made up by somebody, and sure, they took inspiration from a lot of folk magic and ancient traditions and what have you, but it wasn't a direct lineage between witches of old and witches of new. That's not what happened. So the 1940s is the best guess for the very beginning of Wicca. Now, the man who, quote-unquote, invented Wicca was Gerald Gardner. That might be recognizable to some people. Gerald Gardner, also the header of the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca. Wicca began being used in reference to his practice, although he never actually used the word Wicca to describe the religion or Wiccans to describe people who practice it. Other people did. So that's a fun little tidbit. But Gerald Gardner was the father of modern Wicca. He got a lot of his ideas from other people. One place was Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. And the witch cult in Western Europe has been largely disproven. I mean, it was disproven almost instantly by people who actually study these time periods. And the witch cult of Western Europe posed this theory that there was a unifying pre-Christian witchcraft-based religion throughout Western Europe, and talked about the Burning Times and etc. And as I've said, none of that happened. So he based a lot of it on that. He said that he found a coven of witches, which he might have. But he said he found a coven of witches that were hereditary witches who had been practicing for hundreds of years. And we know that's not what happened. So, more than likely, he found some people who had started practicing something they took from folk magic and from this history that they have, probably about their own ancestors. And he adapted it into something different. He also adapted a lot of Aleister Crowley. He just kind of filled it in there, which was the funny kind of perverted stuff, which is really indicative of who Gerald Gardner was. He was kind of a showboating ladies' man type guy. He really wanted to get famous for being a witch, which is incredibly entertaining. It doesn't make him any less good, but it does make him way funnier. So he based this religion that he created on mythology, history, folk traditions, different writings by different writers. Maybe there was a coven, but it's way more likely that he invented Wicca from the beginning. Like I said, it's not bad. Religion's all got to start somewhere. But that is the truth of Wicca, is that in the 1940s it was invented by some random guy in England, and it took off. he started this in the 40s. He started his own coven, and by the 50s, it had really started taking off. And this is when he took someone under his wing called Doreen Valiente. You've got to look at pictures of Doreen. She's just the cutest thing on two legs. Her photographs are these glamorous, mid-century, modern woman with her cat eye glasses, just sitting at the most beautiful Wiccan altar you've ever seen in your life. And Doreen was fantastic. Doreen organized Gerald Gardner's notes. Doreen took out a lot of the Aleister Crowley stuff that she found to be kind of silly. Doreen wrote the Wiccan Rede, which is the Wiccan rules, the Wiccan morality rules, essentially. She wrote poems about witchcraft that she included in this Book of Shadows. She really legitimized the entire operation. And then she left. Not very long after. I don't even know if she lasted an entire 10 years, because she believed that Gerald Gardner had made most of it up. And Doreen was a strict believer in Margaret Murray's, unifying witchcraft religion and the idea of a central mother goddess. That's what she wanted to believe, so she went on and did that. So her writings, although very cool, very historical, again, they contribute to this wonderful Wiccan mythology, should be taken with a grain of salt. But that happened in the 1950s. In the late 1950s and the early 60s, you have more Wiccans happening. So in the 1960s, you have a new tradition coming around called Alexandrian. And the Alexandrians really preached the idea of traditional or hereditary witchcraft, which again, I take issue with, but that was their thing. And you got a lot of animosity in the 60s between these Alexandrian witches and these Gardnerian witches. Wicca became a way to refer to people who had just picked it up on their own as they went, and witches were people who really had this real lineage going on. And there was this pretentiousness that still, I think, exists today with the traditional or hereditary witches. They believed that they were really descendant from this long line of ancient witches, and they lorded that over people who had chosen Wicca on their own. And I don't think that's fair. I'm not a big fan. But through the Alexandrian tradition, you had a lot of authors and prominent Wiccans come about that would then split off and do their own things. One such person was Raymond Buckland. And in the 70s, Raymond Buckland started his own tradition, which included your Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements. So Raymond Buckland was the first one to say, the goddess and the god were Odin and Freya. And now we have tons of Norse pagans, heathen pagans. There's just so many. They're all over the place, and it's become very popular. There are a lot of followers of Odin and Thor. I have a few friends who are, and that is all because of Raymond Buckland. That began in the 70s. So again, quit claiming it's ancient. The mythology may be ancient, but you're not. But it's cool. Also in the 70s, just a little before Raymond Buckland there, you have the rise of Dianic witchcraft, which is now called Dianic Wicca. And this was started by Susanna Budapest in Los Angeles. So this is our American witchcraft. And what she did, she mixed witchcraft with elements of feminism. The 70s is when feminism was really taking off in that second wave there. And she considered witchcraft to be every woman's birthright. It's no secret that most of the people who were executed under the guise of them being witches were women, especially poor women who had to live in ways that were not considered quite so godly, which is a whole other episode of this podcast, I promise. So she considered witchcraft to be every woman's birthright, and she created Dianic Wicca. Diana was the Roman goddess of the moon. She was the virgin goddess. Her Greek counterpart is Artemis, for those who know Greek and Roman mythology. And so that has become the completely female-based version of Wicca. And a lot of the Dianic covens will completely forego the idea of gods. Just go with goddesses. They will only admit women into their covens. There are some Dianic covens that are entirely populated by lesbians. The one issue with Dianic Wicca is that in this modern age, you still have a lot of Dianic covens only accepting women-born women, and I say that with a grimace on my face and air quotes because I think that's gross, and not accepting trans women. That's something that's really got to change, and that's a part of their history they don't really want to talk about. But that happened in the 70s, and that was huge. And the first coven that was a Dianic coven was called the Susan B. Anthony Coven #1, which I find to be the best coven name I've ever heard. Dianic Wicca attracted a woman named Starhawk, who became a really famous pagan writer, and she took Dianic Wicca and she mixed it with lots of other things to create the reclaiming tradition. So then you had this version of Wicca that was still very female-centered, though not entirely female-centered, that included different elements. So you have a little bit of the Norse, you have some of the New Age stuff, you have fairy tradition that has been mixed into that. So reclaiming was kind of like Dianic light, you know. It was still very empowering for women without leaving out everyone else. So I like reclaiming. That's a fun one. The 80s have some really important Wiccan history, but not a lot of really fun stuff. I feel like the 80s were a little bit too techy for old school witchcraft, but what you do have in the 80s is professionals that are taking over witchcraft. So in 1985, the Lady Liberty League was established. The Lady Liberty League is a group of pagans with law degrees and who are counselors and who are PR people who work to protect the rights of witches and pagans and etc. all over the U.S. So the Lady Liberty League has taken over quite a few things, quite a few civil rights cases involving pagans, and they were established in 85. In 1986, which is the same year I was born, Wicca was officially recognized as a religion in the United States. And this is kind of a story that a lot of people have heard. It was a prisoner who was a practicing Wiccan. He was in jail, and he petitioned that not being allowed to have things like an athame, candles, incense, things that could be potentially dangerous that we just don't give to prisoners, that refusing to give him those things infringed on his religious freedom. And although he lost the right to have things like knives and lighters in prison, what did happen is that the Supreme Court of the United States recognized that Wicca is an official religion in the U.S. So that was a huge deal. After the 80s, you have the 90s. And as I said, this is the golden age of Wicca and witchcraft. It really is. This is when it got huge. And this is, I feel like maybe I take it a little bit personally when a lot of Wiccan teachers leave out the 90s in their history lesson. I think I take it personally because it meant so much to me and so much to the other people my age, of which there are thousands who found paganism and witchcraft and Wicca in the 90s, and it completely changed our lives. Many people think of witchcraft in the 90s in terms of the pop culture aspect, and there's nothing wrong with that. So in the 90s, you have this surge of things like Practical Magic and Charmed, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It just went on and on and on. The Craft came out, and it was huge. This legitimately showed teenage girls practicing witchcraft on purpose. And although none of these movies really show anything very real or realistic, many of them use the word Wicca or witch or witchcraft, and that was big in the 90s. And it went a long way towards making it more accessible. So in the 90s, you really started being able to get pentacle jewelry just about anywhere. I could get it at the mall, and I live in a pretty small town. So you could get pentacle jewelry all over the place. You could get wands, you could get athames, you could get altar cloths, you could get altars themselves. Herbal shops that were kind of trendy and new started popping up all over the place. Witchcraft was huge and trendy, and it was just amazing. And this really mixed with the girl power vibe that you got in the 90s. So in the 70s, Dianic Wicca came out because of second wave feminism. In the 90s, feminism was not being called that, but it was big. Women really owned the 90s. The although boy bands were there, I mean, still, Spice Girls are bigger than any boy band ever. Britney Spears, you have these, within pop culture, you have your music, your movies, your TV shows, your clothing style, your everything was dominated by the needs of women and young girls especially. So all of these teenage witches were all over TV and in songs and in movies. But a lot of covens that were around didn't accept teenagers. This just wasn't something that happened. So in the 90s, what you have is this surge of solitary practitioners. So Scott Cunningham released Wicca for the Modern Solitary Practitioner in the 90s, and that was a big deal. That book still is a big deal. And then you have other writers who capitalized on the teen witch movement, like Silver Ravenwolf. And I'm going to try not to say anything bad, because her books changed my life. And I have so many of them. I'm looking at Teen Witch and To Ride a Silver Broomstick right now, because the nostalgia I feel when I look through them, it makes my heart flutter. It changed my life when I was a kid. Now those books are not... Now Silver Ravenwolf is not so relevant. And I can say with absolute certainty that if you go into a store, you know, a metaphysical store, and they're trying to teach Wicca or witchcraft out of a Silver Ravenwolf book, you should probably leave, like right away. But they were a big part of our Wiccan history, and I feel like maybe Wiccans leave it out because it's a little bit shady, but you shouldn't, because it's fun, and it's even a little bit funny. In the 90s, you also have the internet come in, and the internet changed witchcraft in such a crazy way. I still remember the first ever Wiccan website that I used. It was called silvermoon.net. It was all very purple, and there were like spinning, glittery icons, like GIFs all over it. Silvermoon.net was really amazing, and I still have printouts from it in my old Book of Shadows from when I was a kid, which is a Harry Potter notebook. So you have this rise of techno-pagans. You have the internet that can connect solitary practitioners, so you don't have to be in a coven, or you can be in an online coven. Yahoo groups was huge in the 90s, and I can't even say it without laughing. Yahoo groups was huge in the 90s, and lots of witches and Wiccans were connecting over that, finding other people with similar beliefs. Witchbox, the witch's voice, still exists. You can go to witchbox.com. And you can put up a listing of who you are and what you're about, and you can list your groups, you can list your classes and events, your website, what have you. You can write articles. And that one was huge. That was the closest thing witches had to Facebook back in the day. That started in the 90s. In 1995, we had even more legal advances in Canada, especially the Aquarian Tabernacle Church in British Columbia. The two women who ran it got permission to become the first ever Wiccan wedding chaplains, hospital chaplains, prison chaplains, that kind of thing. They could perform last rites, marriages, they could talk at funerals. Our first Wiccan wedding happened in 1995. In the 90s, that fun witch vibe of the 90s never really died down, though it did get a little bit more fantasy. You have things like Harry Potter that came out at the tail end of and into the 90s and into the 2000s. Wicca became normal. Unfortunately, it wasn't normal everywhere. It still isn't. And in 2001, I believe more than one teenage girl took her own life because she was bullied so hard for being a practicing Wiccan. I was bullied a little bit in high school, but the rumor that went around was that I ate babies out of a large cauldron. And that's such an absurd rumor that I'm surprised it passed between more than like one or two people. I don't know how you spread a rumor like that with a straight face, but it happened for a little while. A friend of mine had a dead chicken hanging in their locker. This was the early 2000s. That was really bad. But the 90s, the resurgence of Wicca in the 90s is so huge. And it was so huge that many of the most prolific writers that you have now got started in the 90s or began writing in the 90s. So you have your Silver Ravenwolfs and your Scott Cunninghams, and in the 90s they got huge. But a lot of the writers that are coming out now started practicing themselves in the 90s. So you have a lot of people that started out like I did. They started out watching The Craft and Practical Magic and quoting that one to high heaven. I mean, I'd watch Practical Magic at least twice a month. It's really bad. And Joni Mitchell has become like a witch in my mind. So you have all these writers that are now coming into that got into Wicca in the 90s. And the nice thing about the 90s is that starting in the 90s, you had more people who were interested in legitimizing the entire operation. So this history lesson that a lot of Wiccans and witches in general, this history lesson that they perpetrate created this divide between scholars and academics and then pagans. And it kind of turned pagans into a joke. And in the 90s, that Burning Times myth, although there were lots of amazing, terrible GeoCities websites dedicated to the Burning Times as a little altar, that kind of started to die out. And many times when I do hear someone perpetrating this myth, it's usually by someone who started before the 90s, and I can always tell. But in the 90s, this kind of started to die out, and you had a lot more Wiccans and neo-pagans and people who were moving beyond Wicca now to do their own thing. You had them get a little bit more academically inclined, and so the real history of Wicca is starting to come out a bit more, but I still don't hear it enough, Wiccans. In the 2000s, Wicca continued to be huge. In 2004, the first Wiccan wedding happened in the UK that was legally recognized. In 2005, which was 10 years ago now, a U.S. soldier, Sergeant Patrick Stewart, he died while he was stationed in Afghanistan. Rest in peace. 2005. And he was a practicing Wiccan. And at the time, the Veterans Affairs Office did not offer a pentacle as a religious symbol that could go on his gravestone or his plaque. And his wife, there was nothing else there that represented their faith. So it took over a year for her to get a plaque with a pentacle on it to be approved and put up. For a long time, he was just a blank space on a wall, which is horrifically sad. In 2006, the Americans United for Separation of Church and State took on the case, and they sued on her behalf, and they won. And they got his pentacle plaque. They also got more pagan religious symbols added to this acceptable list. So now you have not only the pentacle, but I believe you can get Thor's hammer as well. And there's a few other that keep getting added all the time. And that situation didn't officially get settled until 2007, so it took 2 years for the U.S. and the Veterans Affairs Office to recognize that this man, who had died fighting for his country, should have his religion be accepted. At the time, George Bush even said out loud that he didn't think it was a real religion. He had a meeting with a lot of other soldiers families who had died around that time, and Sergeant Stewart's wife wasn't invited. George Bush called later to apologize, but I mean, really. So that is a more modern history of Wicca, and I want to talk a little bit about why this is important. Not only is it important to acknowledge actual history and the difference between history and myth, that is so important, but when you continue to perpetuate this false story, it spreads all over the place, and it creates this divide between pagans or witches or what have you and the rest of the world. And that's not what you want. You don't want to continue to label yourselves as other, or as a joke, or as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. You know, in the same breath, I'll hear Wiccans talk about the burning times and then make fun of how not real the Bible is. I mean, get real. At least the Bible happened 2,000 years ago. There's a reason we don't know if it's real. But the truth about witchcraft is almost very clearly written in the history books. There's some false history, but most of the false history has been totally disproven. And there's new history being found every day. And the truth of it is that you can't give a Wiccan history lesson without talking about the 20th century, because it wasn't invented until the 20th century. And this is just a really big pet peeve of mine, and I've been ranting a little bit. So that is your modern Wiccan history lesson, modern history of witchcraft. How did you find it? Are you a 90s Wiccan as well? I mean, I am a serious 90s witchcraft practitioner. I make a joke about it when people ask what kind of pagan I am. I say, is 90s witchcraft a religion? Because if so, that's it. And it is. I can practice magic and watch practical magic all at the same time, and it doesn't feel inauthentic to me. It's lame. It's lame, but it's amazing, and the fashion choices are still top notch. So how did you find witchcraft, Wicca? Are you a modern 20th century pagan? Are you an ancient pagan that celebrates something that I don't think is real? Let me know. I want to hear all about it. You can email me at fatfeministwitch@gmail.com. You can find me at the Fat Feminist Witch's Broom Closet on Facebook. On Twitter, I am at FatFeministWitch. And you can check me out on my blog, which I will post a link to on all of those other places I already mentioned. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have an amazing Yule or winter solstice or Christmas or whatever. Happy holidays, everybody.